December 1944, the government allowed Japanese evacuees to begin returning to the West Coast. The following August, World War II officially ended with the surrender of Japan.
After the war ended, well then, these people that were like they had a camp in Twin Falls, Idaho, and those people, they were all coming back toward the coast where they lived before. Yeah, the camp was already dispersed, but yet you weren't able to come back to Seattle. I'd say 50% of them or more stopped in Spokane, and they lived there until they were able to come back to the coast.
In March 1946, the last internment camp closed in California. Many Japanese had no homes to return to, no jobs waiting for them, and no money to start over with. And the anti-Asian sentiment that had occurred before and during the war did not disappear.
After I got out of high school, I dated this guy one time, and he wanted to take me to dinner. He was a member of the BOF.
And what did the BOF?
Brotherhood of Friends. And when we went in there, he showed his membership card and everything, and the guy said, well, you can't bring her in here. And he said, well, why not? And I said, well, because you can't. She's not a member. And he said, no, she's a guest, my guest. He said, well, I'm sorry, but you can't come in here, you know, because, well, he didn't come right out and say because she's Japanese, but he just was adamant about it, which embarrassed this guy all to pieces, but it didn't bother me.
When we were looking for a house, and we were going to buy a house in his neighborhood on the south side, but they wouldn't allow us to buy it. They told us we couldn't. They didn't say that you weren't eligible, they weren't diplomatic. They flatly told us we couldn't buy a house.
It took many years after the end of World War II for Issei and Nisei to receive an apology from the U.S. government. The first step was in 1952, when the Walter McCarran Act allowed Issei to become citizens.
In 1952 or 53, they changed that alien business, and my mother and father became eligible to become American citizens. And so my older brother Roy and I coached my mother and dad on the questions that were going to be asked. I can remember watching them being sworn in. You know, one of those really feel-good things, you know.
Even after they gained full citizenship, Japanese were still discriminated against. Listen as one Nisei woman tells about the difficulties of moving into the Seattle suburbs during the 1950s.
And we got an anonymous call saying, you are not welcome. Please stay with your own people. Do not come here. And after our experience of being interned and everything, I didn't want to be held down by that, but I was afraid too. And then, on the other hand, the neighbors in that particular neighborhood got together and they bombarded me with phone calls and said, this is one party that is doing this. The rest of you want to welcome you, so please come.
Other minority groups recognized the injustice of Japanese-American treatment during World War II. One Nisei man remembers being offered a job after the war ended by a Native American construction foreman who felt sympathetic toward his treatment as a minority.
He came over to the Union Hall and needed help. He came up to me and he said, you want a job? And I said, well, that's what I'm here for. And I told him I was just an apprentice, so he said, well, that's all right, I'll teach you things. But he was a partially Indian blood in him, and he told me, he said, I know what you've been through, and I'm going to help.
It wasn't until the 1980s, however, that an official presidential apology was issued and redress was given to those who had been affected by internment. Today, Nisei, who lived through the internment and evacuation experience, continues struggling to understand why and how internment and evacuation occurred.
I wonder how it would have been if we were older. Sometimes wonder about that. Like Gordon Hirabashi, he's what, about 5 years older than I am, and he stood up. Most of these guys that did resist were a little older than. See, I just turned 19. If we were all, say, 25 to 35, I wonder what difference that would have made on this evacuation thing. We never know.
Because a lot of times even after the war, I'd lay in bed, and if someone called me a Jap, what would I say? And when I try to come up with answers, I know that I wouldn't be able to say anything when it came time, so I always wrote it down. I wrote not a lot of letters to people that offended me.
There is a saying that history often repeats itself. Today, the experiences of Nisei during World War II are not irrelevant. Their stories reflect the courage of individuals who survived and adapted to an extreme situation. But it is also a story with a warning. Under what circumstances can the Constitution and the civil rights it ensures for all citizens become compromised? How can we, as American citizens, remain vigilant about protecting the rights we assume will always shield us from discrimination? From Coasting Camp to the Inland Empire was created at Whitworth College in Spokane, Washington by Janet Hauk and Rose Sliger. Funding was provided by the Washington State Civil Liberties Public Education Act through the sponsorship of the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction. Grant writer Janet Hauk. Oral historian, writer, and editor Rose Sliger. Narrator Brooke Kiner. Audio editing and post-production provided by Larry Ellingson.